Hi everyone, welcome to Yoga with Heini. I'm Heini, and in this video we're going to go through the downward facing dog pose in detail. Downward facing dog is a rather complex pose. It involves so many joints, it involves the whole body. So we're going to go through the pose piece by piece. And we're going to start by looking at the hands. So we'll come first onto all fours. This is where we often start the pose, from all fours. It's a good starting place. And first, find a place for your hands where you feel you have a clear pathway from your shoulders down to your hands. And it could be shoulder width apart. It could be a bit wider. It could be a bit more narrow placement. So there's no one right place for your hands. Find a place where you feel supported, you feel quite strong through the arms and across your both hands. We are going to spread the fingers rather wide apart. Don't go as wide apart as you could, but just find a place where you can use your fingers. So we don't want to flatten our hands and flatten the fingers. That might end up creating too much pressure in the wrist. So rather, think about just slightly gripping the mat with the fingertips and then creating a small arch under both hands, under both palms. So the fingers are not flat, but there's kind of a slight arch under both hands. And this will engage some of the muscles that go to your fingers, go through your wrists, so you start to create a bit more stability and support around the wrists as well. Then check your elbows. So if you have hyper-extending elbows, if you have a tendency to just kind of hang on the joints when it comes to your elbows, bend the elbows slightly. So again, you're almost forcing the muscles around the joint to activate, to stay engaged when there's a slight micro bend in the elbows. Then we're going to come up to the shoulders, and this is where things start to get a bit more complicated because we don't have any one right way to place our shoulders in the pose. You might have heard that you should externally rotate your shoulders in downward dog. It's quite kind of general cue that you often hear in classes, in trainings. And for many people it works because for many people it might create a bit more space in the shoulder. But it's not going to work for everybody. We have such different bodies, such different builds, that we can't just take it as a blanket cue and say that that's how we should do the pose. And I'll give you one example why that might not work. Our forearm, so our lower arm from elbow down, has a natural rotation. So the bones, they kind of twist, they kind of cross each other in the forearm. But how much of this kind of rotational movement we have in the forearm, it varies from one person to another. And because in downward facing dog, we are grounding through the hand. So the hand is kind of creating a base for the pose. The hand is down on the mat. The rotation of the forearm is going to affect what needs to and what can happen in the shoulder. And this is something you can test for yourself. So if you're just sitting and bend your elbow and fix your elbow, so you could hold your elbow with the other hand, just making sure that we don't start to rotate from the shoulders, but we're really just looking at how much rotation, how much movement we have in the forearm. So we're going to hold the elbow and we're going to start with hand facing up to the ceiling, and then start to slowly rotate your hand down towards the ground, down towards the mat, without cheating from the shoulder, just making sure all the movement comes from your forearm, and see how far you can rotate your hand. And if it goes kind of parallel to the floor, you have quite a lot of movement there, quite a lot of rotation. And it might mean that you can find that external rotation, and that might be fine for you. But if we have a situation where this is as far as we can go, not because we are somehow bad yogis or we should practice more, just how the bones are in our body, just how the bones sit together. If this is as far as we can go, and then you are asked to place your hand on the mat, where does the movement need to come from? Where does that extra rotation to place hand on the mat needs to come from? From the shoulder. Because we're not going to do our downward dog like this. No, this is not going to be a stable support. So then for this person to bring their hands down, we need to actually create some more internal rotation in the shoulder, just in order to get the hand down. So that's just an example how our bones might dictate where different movements need to come from, and how much rotation this way, how much rotation that way is even possible. So we can't take external rotation as a general cue for this pose, but rather looking for a place where you feel you can find some strength through the arms, especially then when we lift into the pose. So in downward dog, we're not going to be on hands and knees. We're going to lift up onto hands and feet. And this is where that rotation might start to play a bigger part. So really just finding a place where you feel you have strength, you have clear pathway from your shoulders down to your hands, and you feel you can use strength, you can activate your arms. When we start to lift off the mat higher up, we might start to feel a bit more pressure in the wrists as well. So now, when we are in downward dog, we want to take that extra pressure off the wrist joints. And if we keep our weight here forward, we are placing quite a lot of pressure on the wrists. And if you look at the wrist, we can see kind of those wrinkles, I like to call them wrist wrinkles. And we try to find a bit more straight angle through the wrists and take those wrinkles away. So from here, we start to use more our core, hip flexors, shifting the weight back more towards the feet. Not thinking about, okay, I have to press my heels down, but rather think about lifting, reaching the pelvis, the hips away from the hands. I'm gonna bend my knees, so that gives me more space to create that longer line from hands up to the hips. So really starting to use more core, hip flexor activation to pull the pelvis up and back away from the hands. Our spine is going to be rather neutral, or what we call axial extension. So like you're trying to make yourself taller, like you're trying to make your spine longer by reaching the pelvis up away from the hands. So don't think about pushing the chest down. Sometimes people think that the chest needs to come down and almost looking for a back bend in the pose, but that might start to put too much pressure in the shoulder joints. So just finding that neutral spine and think of a long line, active lifted line from hands into the hips. Like I said, the knees might need to be bent, because if there's a lot of tension, let's say in the hamstrings, in the calves, to somewhere in the backs of the legs, what sometimes happens if we
think about, okay, we have to straighten the legs. There's tension in the back of the legs that starts to pull the pelvis and starts to create a very rounded shape in the back. So then in order to maintain that neutral spine, we might need to just soften the knees, take a bit more, create a bit more space in the backs of the legs, and maybe with time we might come to a situation where the legs are straight, but that's not really something to focus on in the beginning. I would always first start creating that clear, safe pathway from hands to the shoulders, finding that neutral spine, and then we'll start to look at if the knees need to be bent or if we can straighten the legs more. Heels might come down. If there is a lot of length in the backs of the legs, the heels might come down onto the mat. But again, tightness in the backs of the legs might need us to keep the heels off the mat, or maybe just the heels stay off the mat. Well, it might not be our choice. So don't feel that you have to press down through the heels. You can think about more kind of weight going down through the heels, but don't force the heels down. You can also play with the length of the dog. So you don't have to keep your hands and feet in a fixed place. Sometimes you could have your hands and feet kind of further apart. Sometimes you could bring them a bit closer in, and it might allow you to explore different areas of your body in that pose. You might start to target different areas of your body in the pose, whether you're looking for more of an opening in the backs of the legs, or you want to really focus more on strengthening through the upper body, strengthening through the core. Wherever you are, let your neck be soft. So you can let the heavy head hang down towards the mat. Sometimes nice to even shake the head, just checking that we are releasing through the neck. And remember, hands don't have to be necessarily shoulder width apart. I personally bring always my hands a bit wider apart. It gives me a more clear, a stronger pathway from my hands to my shoulders and to the upper back. And when we are looking for that clear pathway, we want the arms connected in the upper back rather than arms growing from our ears. So try to find a place where you could release the tops of the shoulders away from the ears. So rather than jamming our shoulders into our ears, soften the tops of the shoulders so you feel there is space between your ears and the shoulders. The neck is free. And of course, the same can go to your feet. You don't have to keep your feet hip width apart. Sometimes having them wider apart, sometimes having them closer together works better for different bodies. So it is a rather complex pose. There's a lot of things to focus on. Choose one area that you focus on first, and then slowly, piece by piece, build your downward facing dog from there. Breathing in downward facing dog can sometimes feel quite challenging because we are upside down, we are in an inversion. Coming into the pose, again, there are different ways to breathe. So I tend to suggest that we exhale when we come into downward facing dog, just to find that kind of lift engagement through the core that happens quite naturally when we exhale. So I like to exhale, breathe out into the pose and kind of lift up through the lower belly. It helps me with the core engagement. But very often you hear also people asking you to breathe in when you go into the pose, and it works equally well. So you could also breathe in, and for many people that inhalation gives that sensation of kind of lifting up, more of a flying up sensation. So there's really no right or wrong way to breathe.
going into the pose, and just the same coming down. You could exhale, or you could inhale coming down. There is no right or wrong way to breathe going in and coming out from the pose. When we are in the pose, like I said, sometimes it might feel a bit challenging to breathe because we are upside down. So our breathing mechanism is going to be upside down as well. In order to maintain the core engagement and that kind of lifting, slightly lifting in and up through the lower belly, it might be more useful to target the breath to the rib cage. So finding more what we call lateral breathing, breathing to the bottom of the ribs, then breathing all the way down to the belly. But also sending the breath to the rib cage so that we don't start to lift the breath up to the shoulders, to the neck. Because we are already stressing the upper body, the shoulder structure, the upper back quite a lot. We want to keep that action for staying in the pose rather than starting to breathe with the shoulders, starting to breathe with the neck. So send the breath down to the rib cage and keep the neck soft. Rather than pulling your chin to your chest, that you sometimes hear being cued, that we're kind of trying to push the head through the arms, keep the neck soft. Because here, if you're jamming your neck too much, again, you might be blocking your own breath and just making the breath even more difficult than it already is. So keep the neck soft, let the head just hang in a relaxed way down and keep breathing. I think that's the main thing. As long as you keep breathing in the pose, you don't start to hold your breath and wait that you can come down from the pose and then you're going to breathe. But just keep breathing throughout the pose. There's a lot of things to focus on, so sometimes we also need to remind ourselves to breathe. There are a few different ways we can use props in downward dog, and we'll start with blocks. Now, if you have injuries, if there's achiness, tenderness in your hands, in your wrists, you could do downward dog down on your elbows. So you could do the pose just coming down on the mat, so it's like a dolphin pose, and do the pose from here. But sometimes we feel that we're too close to the mat. There's not really space for the neck, for the head, and that's where blocks can be really nice. So we could use blocks under our forearms, under the elbows, and do the pose from here. So you could either just have your hands turned down towards the mat, or you could have the blocks in a bit of an angle. You could even interlock your fingers. But the idea is that the weight goes through your elbows, forearms, rather than through your hands and wrists. So you can practice same actions, same things here, with your forearms, elbows on the blocks. You could use a bolster for that as well. So you could bring a bolster under your forearms. Just sometimes we need to be a bit careful because the bolster is not as sturdy on the mat as the blocks. So there's a bit more movement in the bolster. But as well, you might get your elbows, forearms kind of sitting more, pushing them inside the bolster. So in some sense, it might even be a bit more stable. But you could do the exact same thing here. So again, elbows, forearms on top of a bolster. So you don't need to put the weight through your hands, your wrists. Then, another way of using a block, push that aside, is between the legs. Sometimes we are so focused on what's happening in the upper body that we kind of almost forget to use the legs. Our legs are stronger than our upper body. So practicing some engagement and just reminding the legs to work can be really quite handy. And you can use a block between the legs. So between the inner thighs, between the knees. And it could be one block, it could be 2 blocks, depending on how wide, how big your block is. But just gently squeezing the block between the legs. And that can help us keep the inner legs more engaged. And some people actually find that this is helpful with hamstring pain, if there's any hamstring injuries or just maybe pain in hamstrings in these kind of forward folding poses where the hips are in quite deep flexion. This can also help to find engagement in the legs that protects the hamstrings and take some stress and stretch and pressure off the hamstrings. So block between the legs can be really quite nice and just also different. If you haven't tried that, try it and you might find something new in your downward dog. I'll show you one more way you could use blocks. So you could bring the floor to your feet in downward dog, and that might take pressure off your feet. So in downward dog, you could use blocks under the feet, under the heels, and that might give you a sense of support. It might help you to engage more through the legs, but also it takes pressure off the front of the foot and ankle if you feel that you start to pinch in the front of the ankle. So that could be one more way to use props to support and take pressure away from areas that might struggle in the pose. A really good way to start practicing downward facing dog is with the wall. It's easier on the wrists, on the arms, because there's less pressure, less weight going through the arms, through the shoulders. And it's a really good way to start practicing that lengthening, that reaching up and back through the pelvis. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring hands onto the wall and just start to walk your hands down, maybe walk the feet a bit further back. So you come into that downward facing dog pose shape with your hands on the wall. Keep the knees just a bit bent so you're not locking the knees. And then ground down through the hands on the wall and start to actively reach your pelvis away from the wall. So you're trying to keep the hands not coming off the wall, but at the same time lengthening the back, like there's someone pulling your pelvis away from the wall. Or you could even ask a friend to give you a gentle pull. So you start to really feel that active lengthening, reaching back through your pelvis, through your whole back. And once you are ready, just walk yourself away from the wall. And that's how you can practice the pose together with the wall. Because downward facing dog is such a complex pose, involves a lot of joints, a lot of different muscle groups, basically your whole body is in the pose. We need to be careful, and if you know that you have injuries, take them into consideration when you are planning to practice the pose. For example, if you have injuries or pains in the hands and wrists, make sure you're not pushing through that pain. The pose should not be painful on your wrists or on your hands. And for example, you could opt for the variation to do the pose on your elbows, on your forearms. If you have hyperextending elbows, you can be mindful of this, and maybe that slight bend in the elbows helps you to keep the muscles engaged. We don't want to hang on the joints. There's going to be a lot of weight going through the elbows, and we don't want to hang on the joint. In an active pose like this, we want to keep muscles around the joint active, so we are protecting the joint. If you have shoulder injuries or maybe just pains in the shoulders, poses where arms go overhead might be aggravating injuries or pains and aches in the shoulders. So again, be mindful of how you feel and would different kind of rotation in your shoulder help with those sensations in the shoulders. And if you know that activities where bringing arm overhead is going to aggravate your injury, your condition in the shoulder, then don't push it. You could also practice being on all fours, being on hands and knees when there is a downward facing dog in the sequence. Because again, you don't want the pose to hurt in your shoulders. If you have any issues with hip flexion, so poses where you are folding forward from the hips, you could play with your feet placement in the pose. Sometimes having feet wider apart takes pressure off the hips, of the hip joint. So again, the pose shouldn't hurt in the joints. So feel free to adjust where the legs are, or you can also adjust the length of your downward facing dog, and that might help your hip joints as well. Hamstring injuries might be aggravated by the pose, especially if you're really actively lifting your sit bones up. You're asking a lot of length in the hamstrings, in the backs of the legs. Remember, you can always soften the knees, and don't be too aggressive pulling and pushing your sit bones, your tailbone up. Find a place and find a shape that doesn't hurt in the hamstrings. And remember, you can try using the block between the legs, so find more engagement in the inner thighs, and that might help you to balance what's going on in the hamstrings. Again, you don't want to aggravate an injury. And then finally, the feet and the ankles. Make sure that you don't feel any kind of pinching in the front of the ankles, front of the feet. So again, maybe adjusting what's happening higher up in the legs and the hips can help your feet as well. If that doesn't help, so then using the blocks, bringing the floor to your feet can help the feet and ankles if that's where you experience pain in your downward facing dog. I don't like to talk too much about medical conditions because I'm not a medical expert, but just be aware of your existing conditions. So if you know that doing inversions, going upside down, placing your head below your heart might be an issue, then talk to your medical professional before practicing the pose. Doing downward facing dog during pregnancy might be okay, but again, you need to listen to your body, and if you're not sure, check with your medical professional if doing inversion type of poses is okay for your pregnancy. Remember, if you have injuries or existing medical conditions, always talk to your medical professional before practicing the pose. But if you have any questions about the pose, about variations, how to use the props, you can always send me a message, leave a comment below, and just let me know your thoughts, and I'm very happy to chat further about the pose. Thanks for watching. I hope you found that useful. If you did, please click subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified on new videos. I'll be posting lots more yoga related videos. And I also teach live stream online classes, and if you're interested in those, check the details in the description box below. I'll see you on the next video. Bye.